So we're talking about chapter 2, and this particular part is the formation of chemical bonds. So remember how we talked earlier about how atoms can have valence shells full of electrons and are very stable, but atoms that have their valence shells not full, meaning they either have less than 8 in shell 2 or 3, or less than 2 in shell 1. If they are incomplete, that means that they can either transfer electrons or they can share electrons with other atoms. And when that happens, those atoms, because they're sharing electrons or they've been transferred from one to another, we say that those are chemical bonds, those attractions that are held between them. The atoms stay close together in this thing called a chemical bond. There's lots of different kinds of chemical bonds, so let's go through some of them right now. The first and maybe the most important one is the covalent bond. A covalent bond is what happens when electrons are shared between two atoms. And we always say a pair of valence electrons are shared because a valence electron in one atom is going to share with the other, and the other is going to share with the original. So the two electrons, one from this one and one from this one, are going to share electrons. That is what forms a covalent bond. And if you have something that is a compound that's held together in a covalent bond, we give that a specific name. Those atoms are now called the constituents of a molecule. So we now have, in this example right here, we have a hydrogen molecule that's made up of 2 hydrogen atoms. The way that we designate that hydrogen molecule is using the letter H, which is the symbol for hydrogen, with a subunit 2. That means there's 2 hydrogen atoms in the molecule. And electrons we can show that molecule and how it exists with each other by looking at an electron distribution diagram, or we can look at something called the structural formula. And you can see below here is an example of the structural formula. It would be H-H, where that H is 2 electrons being shared, a pair of electrons being shared between both hydrogen atoms. If you're looking at an electron distribution diagram for the same compound, you'd actually draw the 2 atoms right there, and there's the 2 electrons right there, and there's the 2 atoms. So the electron distribution would be there's an electron, and there's your 2 hydrogen atoms. When we're doing the structural formula, remember the structural formula is the one with the dash there. That's actually kind of useful because you can use that dash to show whether you've got 1 pair of electrons being shared, like here, or you could have a double bond, 2 pairs of electrons being shared. And if you draw a double line there, that's saying that, oh, it's a double bond. You've got 2 pairs of electrons being shared between these two atoms. So we can look at the various ways of showing those diagrams that show the pairing. So here's our hydrogen. This is electron distribution diagram. There's your 2 atoms right there. Here's the structural formula. Sometimes we even look at the space filling molecule, the model. That's nice. Sometimes that's going to be shown to you. Most of the times we're going to be looking at the structural formula. Here's oxygen. It's sharing 2 pairs of electrons, or 4 total electrons. And there's the double bond. In water, you can see that each hydrogen atom is sharing a pair of electrons with the oxygen atom. So this one's sharing 2 electrons, and this one is sharing 2 electrons. That's 2 single bonds, and we're going to draw the structural formula like this, with an oxygen connected to a hydrogen in 2 places. But those are both single bonds. And if we look at methane here, which is CH4, carbon with 4 hydrogen atoms being shared in a covalent bond, it looks like that. And there's the space filling model, which we sometimes see that. So what's really important here is that the number of valence electrons, that tells you the number of bonds that can form. So we call that the bonding capacity, or more commonly we say it's the valence. We're using this word valence a lot in different ways, but they kind of all referring to the same thing. It corresponds to the number of electrons that are needed in order to complete the atom. If you look at elements that are composed of just one type of atom, such as here's a hydrogen molecule, here's an oxygen molecule, O2, we would call those pure elements. We would just say that's a molecule of one type of atom. But if molecules are made up of a combination of two or more types of atoms, then we would say that those are compounds. So molecules is an overarching term. Compounds is more specific to when you've got different atoms involved. And interestingly, atoms, they attract electrons to different degrees. Like some of them are really good at attracting electrons, and some of them are like, meh, they're only okay at attracting electrons. We call that electronegativity. So an atom's electronegativity is the ability for that atom to attract the electrons that are formed in the covalent bond. The more electronegative an atom is, the stronger it pulls the shared electron towards itself. And this gives us a couple of different kinds of bonds that we can think about. If you have a non-polar covalent bond, what that means is that the electronegativity amongst the compound, the atoms in the molecule, it means that they're the same. They're sharing the electron equally. However, if you have a polar covalent bond, one of the atoms is more electronegative and the other is less electronegative. And that means that the atoms are not sharing the electron equally. And this is really, really important for biology, because when you have this unequal sharing of electrons, you get this thing called a partial positive or a partial negative within the molecule. I don't show you a lot of videos inside my video, but I did think that this one would be useful. So let's go ahead and watch this little video and move from there.
A covalent bond is the sharing of a pair of outer shell electrons by two atoms. For example, each of these hydrogen atoms has one electron in its outer shell, but needs two electrons to complete its outer shell. If the two hydrogen atoms share electrons, they can both complete their outer shells. The shared pair of electrons constitutes a covalent bond, shown in shorthand as a line. The covalently bonded hydrogen atoms form a molecule of hydrogen gas. A molecule is defined as two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. An oxygen atom needs two electrons to complete its outer shell. Two oxygen atoms can share two pairs of electrons. A molecule of oxygen gas is held together by a double covalent bond, two shared pairs of electrons. A carbon atom needs 4 electrons to complete its outer shell. It can share electrons with 4 hydrogen atoms, forming a methane molecule containing 4 single covalent bonds. Methane is a compound, a substance formed by the combination of 2 or more elements. We call methane natural gas. It is the fuel burned in gas stoves and furnaces. An oxygen atom needs 2 additional electrons to fill its outer shell. Thus, it can form 2 single covalent bonds. An oxygen atom can share electrons with 2 hydrogen atoms, forming a molecule of water containing 2 single covalent bonds.
So I like that video just because it shows your process. And again, I don't show you a lot of the videos that come with the textbook, but if you want to explore around inside the website that the publisher provides, you can see a lot of very nice animations. So we're on the topic of polar covalent bonds, and water turns out to be a polar covalent bond. The oxygen is electronegative. It means it attracts the electrons more to it. And the hydrogens are less electronegative. That means they're less able to pull those negative electrons to them. So they have a more positive feel about them because the electrons aren't spending much time here. Electrons are going slowly around here, then kind of whipping around here, and then slowly around here, and then whipping around here. So they're spending more time with the oxygen. This is really important for how water behaves, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about water in a minute. A second kind of bond that is not a covalent bond. Remember, we just spent a lot of time talking about different covalent bonds and how they work, and double bonds and all that other stuff. Ionic bonds are different. Ionic bonds, what happens with them is that they literally steal electrons from their bonding partners. So the one that is stealing or stripping the electron and keeping the electron to itself is more electronegative. And the other one that's kind of lost its electron is less electronegative. So those two atoms, they become oppositely charged. The one that gets the electron has a more negative charge. And the one that's lost its electron has a more positive charge. That makes them called ions when they have a charge. And there's a couple of types of ions. You can have a cation that's positively charged and an anion, which is negatively charged. Cations are attracted to anions and they form an ionic bond. A good example is one that we looked at before of sodium chloride. When an atom of sodium encounters an atom of chlorine, the valence electron in the sodium is basically given to or stolen by the chlorine atom. So the sodium atom has a positive charge and the chlorine atom has a negative charge, and they both end up with having complete shells. Let's take a look at what that means. Here's our sodium ion it's got this 1 electron in its valence shell, and here's chlorine with 7 electrons in its valence shell, and the sodium that's less electronegative gives its electron to the chlorine atom. And now both of them I like to say they're both happy because they both have completed valence shells. Anything that forms an ionic bond and forms a compound is also called a salt. And so we think about table salt is the main salt that everybody thinks about. But anytime you've got ionic compounds, that's of 2 different types of elements involved in there, then you will form crystals or salts. So it turns out that we've just talked about 2 fairly strong bonds. Covalent and ionic bonds are fairly strong. Covalent are the strongest of the bonds. But there are other ones that are held together by weak. And ionic bonds, compared to covalent bonds, are quite weak. But then there's other ones called hydrogen bonds and van der Waals interactions, and those are really quite weak, but they're still important even though they're weak. Hydrogen bonds form when a hydrogen atom that's covalently bonded to an electronegative atom, such as oxygen right here, is nearby another molecule that has electronegative partners. So this dotted line right here, is indicating the weak chemical reaction between this slightly positively charged hydrogen atom of water and this slightly negatively charged atom of ammonia, nitrogen being more electronegative than the hydrogen atoms in this ammonia molecule. So they're attracted to each other. That's called a hydrogen bond, and we'll be talking a lot about hydrogen bonds in this class. They're very important. The other one is van der Waals interactions. And van der Waals interactions are when you've got electrons that are distributed asymmetrically in your molecules or atoms. This gives, just like with the hydrogen bonds, it gives a slightly positive or slightly negative charge, which causes the atoms and molecules to stick to each other. But these are very weak, and it only occurs when atoms and molecules are very close together. But if you add up a whole bunch of van der Waals interactions all together, you can actually get something pretty strong. So what scientists have learned is that the fingers of geckos have van der Waals interactions all going on. And so what's happening with the gecko, the reason they can crawl up smooth surfaces like glass, is because all of these all of these weak interactions all add up to a fairly strong interaction, and they can stick to a surface. The next thing that we're going to look at is, just very briefly here, is looking at the molecule shape and function. So a molecule size is actually important to how it's functioning. What you see here is the shape of a water molecule. It's kind of, those hydrogen atoms are held at 104.5 degrees apart from each other. So that's important. And then methane, you get this, it's like the tetrahedron shape. That means a four-sided shape, where one's going straight up and three are kind of spread out evenly down at the bottom, like on a bottom, sort of like a bottom of a pyramid, but with three sides instead of four. So those are going to be important shapes that we're going to be seeing throughout the semester. We could also look at how the shape causes molecules to temporarily bond to each other, and these are going to be important throughout the semester as we look at various and sundry molecules. Here's an example of how shape can be important. And this molecule right here is endorphin. Your body makes endorphin. And this shape right here, especially very important, is part of the endorphin molecule that binds to parts of the cell. In this case, it's binding to a cell in your brain. And this particular region of the cell is called a receptor. In general, this receptor is called an endorphin receptor because it does bond to this region of endorphins. When that happens, the endorphin sends a signal into your brain, and your brain gets all excited, and you have this kind of natural high. It turns out that morphine has a very similar shape, and that one little region of morphine looks really similar to this region of endorphin. You can see how similar they are. Morphine has two oxygen atoms right here, and by the way, you know it's oxygen because they're red, and it gives you a little key up here. Two oxygen atoms, and the endorphin only has one oxygen atom in that binding site. But it's close enough, so morphine can also bind to the natural endorphin receptors, and they bind pretty strongly, and they send the similar signals into the brain. We call morphine a mimic. So a mimic is anything that has a similar shape to a natural chemical in your body. All right, well, we're going to pause it right here again, and you can take it up with the next part of this lecture, Chapter 2, Part 3.